Hello,
Wonderful.
Melinda.
I had a hard
This is
time
the
logging on.
Cleveland East
Apologize.
Senior Network. So it's networking with the heart. I'd like to call upon Melinda Smith without any further ado to introduce our speaker for this morning on our educational program, Kim Langley, and also to thank Roberta Brothman for helping us to keep our educational series going. Please go ahead, Melinda.
Hi, Kim. How are you?
Hello, Melinda. I'm delighted to be here.
I'm glad you came on.
Me
This
too.
is Kim Langley. I'm going to start off with her book. So if you saw the flyer, Send
Oh,
My
you're
Roots
so
Rain,
sweet.
is about grief. I've had her on my podcast 3 times because we talked about the different types of grief.
We did.
She works with different businesses, and don't you do some consulting work with larger corporations?
I do have some big corporate clients, but I do a lot of work in healthcare and not-for-profits because that's, I love supporting those missions.
So that's why we wanted to have her on to talk a little bit about what she does and how you can understand the different types of grief that have happened during this pandemic. So I'm going to just turn it over to her because she
Thank
will
you.
speak most eloquently about what she does.
Oh, I hope so. So let me tell you while I'm doing the screen share here that first of all, it's really a pleasure to be with you, of course. And I am myself acquainted with grief. Before the pandemic, my parents died a month apart, and that was a time, let me tell you. And my dad died right after the funeral of my dear friend Susan, who I had been walking through ALS with for some years. So I know that probably everybody on here has suffered a loss. And one of the interesting things in my own life, and then we're going to jump right in, is that I love words. Before I became a trainer, I was 1,000 years ago an English major. And so I'm going to start with a short poem by Gregory Orr. And Gregory Orr is acquainted with tragedy. Also, he is a fairly famous poet, and I think a wonderful poet. And he accidentally killed his brother in a shooting accident when he was about 10 years old. So can you imagine living with that all your life? But he took his pain and really made it into wisdom. And this is a very short piece. It's in my book, and I think it will set our tone today. It's called Grief Will Come to You. Grief will come to you. Grip and cling all you want. It makes no difference. Catastrophe, it's just waiting to happen. Loss, you can be certain of it. Flow and swirl of the world, carried along as if by a dark current. All you can do is keep swimming. All you can do is keep singing. I love that. I love the turn in this poem. It's inevitable, and that's sad and it hurts. And then all you can do is keep swimming. All you can do is keep singing. So first you swim, and then if you're fortunate and if you do your grief work, you can hope to sing again. So we're going to have plenty of time for Q&A, and I've invited people to put comments and questions in the chat box, but we don't have to hold them all till the end. I've empowered Shalom and Melinda to be my Oprah Winfrey. So if they see something interesting that they want to say, hey, Kim, this is in the box, would you respond to this question? We will do it. And I hope you'll take some notes. I think a lot of you will hear something maybe you haven't heard before. And I would invite you to be free from distractions, because I know how you helping professionals go. It's crazy busy and you're always multitasking. But we have been through a pandemic, my friends, and we're not out on the other side yet. So this is for you. So I'm inviting you to really give an hour to yourself. And this is my grand dog, Tucker, who actually is with me today and looking on, hopefully. And I want to start with the idea that you can't do everything, because I do some coaching too. And one of the things that I hear over and over from people is, I'm just, I have good resilience skills and I've practiced good self-care and I know some things about grief and I'm exhausted. And so I want to normalize that, without being like sorry for ourselves, which doesn't usually help that much. we have been through a lot, and I've had a relatively mild experience of the pandemic because I wasn't an essential worker, so I was able to shelter in place. But I know plenty of people who are just worn down to the bone, homeschooling kids with the help of excellent teachers who have, and teachers I know who've knocked themselves out to make this work, and et cetera, and everybody. So um, I think right now, a lot of us, including me, I put this in because it made me laugh, would like to possess a Buddha-like calm. You know, we would like to say, man, we rode the whirlwind here, and we did. And we also are a lot more like the monkey here. I mean, at least I am, you know, a kind of up and down, a little worn out, would really like a vacation, would really like the world to stop for a week or two so we can catch up with our own spirits. So one of my main messages is it's okay to laugh when you're grieving. And if you can laugh at yourself, I think that's the best of all. So one of my best coping strategies, they haven't all been successful, believe me, during the last year or so, has been just to laugh at myself. Kim, you are a ridiculous person. Look, yesterday you had all this energy and you got all kinds of stuff done, and today all you want to do is watch Hallmark movies, you know. And instead instead of beating myself up all the time, which I am also very good at, um, remembering this image actually has helped me quite a bit. So I don't have to tell you about the graying of America, but there are some people who don't realize that 77 million baby boomers are out there, and 8,000 to 10,000 a day are turning 65. And millennials are quickly becoming the new sandwich generation. And I heard some real stories of heroism, you know, millennials who aren't actually making all that much money, who are financially assisting 2 or even 3 elders, maybe an elder aunt and 2 grandparents, or parents who are older. I mean, you know, we get to hear about stinkers a lot of times in the news, but boy, there are a lot of people out there really knocking themselves out. And it's made all the more difficult because America has become mostly a grief averse culture. Now, not everybody, you know, we can't talk about Americans as if they're one group. So, like the Black community is good at end of life ceremonies and funerals, and respect for the aged, and the Latino community also very good at it, and Native Americans very good at it. So it's not like every American, but in general, Americans 100 years or so ago lived so much closer to grief before the advent of modern medicine than we do now. And so in general, and it's certainly on media, youth and beauty tends to be praised and age tends to be mocked and discounted. And we really saw that rear its ugly head during the pandemic, when we had, you know, national leaders saying the elderly should be willing to die for the sake of the economy. I mean, there were some really, really blatant examples of both ageism and how grief averse we are. And the other thing that's very painful is that the medical model for dying gave rise to language like so and so lost her battle with cancer, as if death could be prevented. And when I wrote my book, I interviewed 40 to 50 people, mostly helping professionals and spiritual caregivers. And most of them said, make people aware in your book that we've lost a lot of the traditional mourning rituals. We don't wear a black armband anymore. We don't dress in full mourning black and then half mourning, you know, lilac or gray. There's no visible sign that people are grieving. And so we've quickly moved into this notion of like, okay, you had 3 days off for the funeral. Now you're back at work. Boom, everything's fine. You're done. You're ready to take on a new project or lead a team. No. A national survey of middle managers in the United States involving thousands of people anonymously, and showed that the majority of managers did not feel ready to make decisions and lead projects when they had to go back to work after a loss. But hey, this is America. We don't really, we act as if death is optional, and then we act as if it's quickly forgettable. So when I was working on my grief book, I really learned a lot about how quickly culture has changed. Some groups have changed to become grief averse. And also there's a lot of misinformation out there. So if we were live, I would say, raise your hand. You can do it in your Zoom if you want to. How many of you could name most of the 5 stages of grief? most helping professionals raise their hands. Sometimes individual grievers are like, well, I'm not so sure. I think I could name 3 of them. But basically, I put this in as a trick question. Does anybody know why? Somebody want to, Melina, you could tell us why, probably.
Well, because wouldn't the grief change based on the culture and based on your age and based on the look? So your stages of grief may vary.
They absolutely vary.
Also, the
And there
grief is
aren't
not a linear. You can't say you move from A to B to C, because I could be
exactly.
bargaining at the same time as feeling guilty and then angry and then back again into acceptance and maybe not so much.
Yeah, thank you. Very good. And both of those things are absolutely true. And then a third thing is also absolutely true, which is that when Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who really was a guru about these things, so I take nothing away from her, but when she was writing, she was really researching and writing stages of dying, not stages of grieving. And even she said before her death that the culture, the general audience has taken her model of stages of dying much too literally, and it's not linear. So first of all, we have a model that was created for the dying, now applied to the grieving, where it's not nearly as neat a fit. And then we have a misunderstanding about how neat a fit it is. So, and it's one of the very few things that right now most Americans actually know. They know there's supposed to be stages of dying and stages of grieving. And so one of the fascinating things that I heard again and again in interviews, and I read research on this, was that some years back when you would go to a grief therapist, you would talk about how sad you were and tell stories about your loved ones and, agonize over any regrets you had and so on. All totally appropriate. Now at the first or second session with a grief counselors told me, one of the typical comments they get very early in the relationship is, I came to see you because I'm not sure I'm doing this right. What a burden to add to the grief already, the worry that you're not doing it right, air quotes. So I'm making a big point of this because I want to send you all out like, missionaries or teachers or whatever model you want to take for it, to let people know in a gentle way that grief is all over the board, and that these stages, while helpful in describing some of the feelings that come with grief, are by no means a right way to go through it. More useful, I think, is the notion of the cages of the stages, which Patrick O'Malley, a celebrated grief counselor, who wrote a book I really recommend, Getting Grief Right, said that the problems of stages and the language of closure and even the language of grief being resolved or getting through grief actually does as much harm as it does good, because it gives you the idea that you should do it right and you should be done with it at a certain point. And that's very prevalent in our culture. So I have a friend who lost her partner of 40 years. And when she went back to work, she saw somebody about 2 weeks after the death. And they said, so are you getting out there yet? Are you dating again? She said, man, I was almost like, they're going to take you out on a stretcher and me out in cuffs, buddy. Imagine the insensitivity of that. But I wasn't surprised to hear it, given how little grief education we have. So Patrick O'Malley says that finding and sharing our stories of grief, of loss and grief, finding them first, being able to give words to them, and then sharing them might be the most important task for grievers. And it's nowhere in the 5 stages. And a lot of upcoming research is bearing that out. So I wanted to share, O'Malley talks about these, and I wanted to share them with you too. And you can just Google around and find all kinds of interesting material. Part of what I hope to do in this hour is just get you started in learning more, because knowledge is very helpful when you're grieving. One of the big challenges of grieving, and I mean, I certainly felt this myself, and I'd written a book on it, like, so what, in one way, but in another way, it's not like I hadn't learned some things, right? But I felt like I was losing my mind a bunch of times during the first year of grief. And I think hearing other people say, guess what, that's pretty normal, and is immensely helpful in this culture where we keep acting like grief is an illness. So Worden's 4 tasks of mourning, and I can send you this as a handout if you like, feel free to put in the chat box anything that you would like as a follow-up. And I have some articles that I can share with the appropriate person. I don't know if that's Melinda or Shalom.
If
You
you
tell me
send
later.
it to me, we'll make sure it gets out to the group.
Yeah, because at least some of the articles will introduce you to a website that is deep and wide and rich and practically an education in itself in terms of the blog. Excellent, well-researched blog posts that are there, but it's research that's adapted for every person, you know. So Worden's 4 tasks of mourning are accepting the reality, and that just takes time. People talk about getting up in the morning and having to remember all over again that the person is gone and that it's painful every day to wake up, and that's normal. And then processing the pain of the grief, which of course takes time, and then adjusting to a world without the deceased. One woman said to me, I totally lost it in the grocery store because I was in the meat section and I was getting ready to pull off a roast that my husband really liked. I'm thinking, I'll make this for him. And then I remembered he was dead. And she said, I just like lost it. My hand was on the roast. That's actually normal, you know, but most of us don't know that. And then the 4th task, to find an enduring connection with the deceased while embarking on a new life. And so you can see that this is not something that happens in a couple weeks. And a big thing is to find the words. That's one of the reasons I wrote my book the way I did. And this is not a buy my book commercial. Believe me, I want you to have what's useful for you. And I have other books besides my own to show you. But I put passages from poems or beautifully written pieces that I thought gave words to the nuances of what grievers feel. And it's been delightful to me to get notes from people that create end-of-life celebrations, you know, funeral directors, clergy, rabbis, spiritual directors, written to me to say, you know, I used that passage in a service. Yes. Do I hear something? Okay. So that's why Mary Oliver, a poet laureate of the United States and a Pulitzer Prize winner, she said, how people come from delight or the scars of damage to the comfort of a poem. And so there are some poems in my book, and I believe that. So let me pause there for a minute and see what questions or comments, because I can't see the chat box this second. I have full screen of my program up. So tell me what, if anything, you'd like me to address now before I move into kinds of grief.
Well, when you go into the kinds of grief, one of the things that you and I've chatted about was
Yes.
how we talk about grief in the terms of death, but how
Yes.
all these things are applicable to what isn't actually physical death, but
Yes.
other things. So is that something you're coming into the next section?
Well, yes, I will mention it, but I'm happy you said something, because one of the things that's made the pandemic so challenging is that it was a bombardment of losses at one time. So just speaking from my own life, like one day I had a full year booked of speaking engagements because I teach for a living, and overnight they disappeared. So not only did I lose my work and my income, which thank heavens we saved, so we were okay, but you know, not everybody can or did. But I had a pretty big identity crisis. Like, who am I now that I'm not helping other people through teaching, because it's a big part of who I am. And then my husband had retired, so we were trying to navigate that. And then we couldn't go anywhere. And our kids, who we joked we should not have been quite as strict with when we raised them, because now they're really strict with us, really made us take a vow that we wouldn't go anywhere, do anything, or see anything. They were so afraid we were going to die. So there were so many kinds of losses. And of course, they're ongoing. Some people are worried they're going to lose their house because they've been unemployed or underemployed for so long. And then the loss of your normal routine. You know, people that had kids were used to sending them off to school and like having a life, and now overnight their whole life changed. So just a huge number of changes, you know, loss of a social life, and it's
And
too many to list.
So this process went along with all of these. I mean, this process of grieving is something that we go through with all of these types of losses in some form.
Yes, and they're all griefs, and it's not, you know, wimpy or exaggerated to call them griefs. In fact, an article that I recommend if you're taking notes appeared of all places in the Harvard Business Review, which I gave HBR a lot of credit for running this. And the title of it was that something like that awkward feeling you have is called grief. And they went, and it's a business document, but they went on to describe how the pandemic losses, apart from any deaths, caused a lot of griefs, and that this was something we needed to be aware of in every facet of our life, including the workplace. So I think some of you would find that a helpful read, and you can easily find it online. Was there anything else, Melinda, before we?
There's an opportunity to put things in the chat. I'll read a couple of the
Thanks, Sean.
comments. I found the book When Bad Things Happen to Good People helpful.
Yes,
Using
me too.
experience and what I learned from going through the terminal illness of a significant other to help others was helpful to me.
Yes, 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 yes. I love that book. Thank you.
I would just like to
Anything else?
echo what you said. Hello, thank you for your comments. What you said about just the compounding of grief. I work with people who are moving, and often they have a really hard time letting go. They're letting go of their home. They're letting go of memories and possessions and the things that anchored them.
Yes.
You know, and this year has been particularly hard, I've noticed, for clients, really hard. And so I'm anxious to hear what more you have to say to be able to offer them some resources, if not more compassion for what they're
Sure.
going through.
So I love your use of the term anchoring. I think we should all pay attention to that, because even those who aren't moving or giving up possessions, although a lot of people did do a purge during the pandemic, I took pictures of things that I had hung on to for years that were sentimental, and I finally gave them away after taking photos of them. But yeah, it wasn't easy. So that's what brings me to this next quote by Alain de Botton, who's a philosopher. He says, "Feeling lost, crazy, and desperate belongs to a good life as much as optimism, certainty, and reason." And honestly, write that down. Maybe get it tattooed on your forearm. No kidding. Because I teach the science of optimism, and I teach the science of happiness. And I love teaching that because we have over 40 years of research on what truly makes people happy, as opposed to what a lot of us think, the myths of happiness. And I also observe that in some people and in some places, optimism can become almost toxic. So for example, I had a friend who has breast cancer. She's doing well now, thank heavens. But when she was first diagnosed and she told her friends, everybody wants to be supportive, but some people know about this much of, healthcare and the relationship to optimism, and they were eager to share that. And she said to me, I said, "How are you really doing?" And she said, "Well, I'm really doing okay, except if one more person tells me to stay optimistic, I'm going to rip their lungs out through their nose." This was so uncharacteristic of her, because she's usually such a positive and non-judgy person, that I knew she had it right up to here with people's like empty consolations instead of kind of listening to her, So I think that letting people know that feeling lost, crazy, and desperate belongs to a good life. It's kind of a little un-American. Sometimes we act as if we don't have a big role for suffering in our lives as Americans. And maybe that's one couple people smarter than me said that's because we're a consumer culture, and a lot of people have spent time trying to convince us that having stuff and buying stuff when you feel lost, crazy, and desperate is the solution, rather than, like learning how to suffer graciously, or learning how to accept, or recognizing, as Gregory Orr said at the beginning, grief will come to you. Grip and cling all you want. It makes no difference.
I think that people don't know how to respond. And so we've lost that ability to just maybe be quiet and listen,
Yes.
instead of we want to fix it.
We want to fix it. Exactly. And I mean, far be it from me to mock modern healthcare. I'm grateful every day for modern healthcare, especially when I was raising my kids. Somebody get an ear infection, you get an antibiotic and it's cured. And 150 years ago, that child might have been hearing impaired for the rest of their lives, just from something simple as an ear infection, which we now can fix. So, but that's not how everybody thinks. Some people will complain about the cost of the antibiotic. Do you know what I mean? And as those folks age, they don't always do real well, because they believe that having stuff and having prestige and being able to throw your weight around is what makes you important. And as we age or get ill, all those things are stripped away. And so it's either a big learning curve or a descent into bitterness for some of those folks.
Here's a question for you, Kim. So
Yeah.
as a group, this Cleveland East Senior Network faced significant challenges at the beginning of the pandemic, as some of us were, possibly losing our jobs. Sometimes the phone stopped ringing as people were maybe afraid to have caregivers in their home. Some of us lost access to facilities where we might have perhaps been marketing or doing different business related activities. So we
Yeah.
had a whole lot of challenges, and we saw seniors. We were hearing, for example, from social workers about people being locked down in their rooms, not having activities, maybe not even being able to eat with other people. The trays were
Yes.
being delivered,
I heard all
upstairs,
that.
kind of like prisoners. And as a group, we decided, you know what, we want to continue to be involved in each other's lives and in helping others. We started volunteering, for example, every Tuesday with a dance performance, line dancing. It's just sort of evolved naturally. And like even, for example, just Tuesday, just a couple days ago, there were probably 25 seniors outside on the patio watching us. And now the CDC says we don't have to wear the masks anymore while we're dancing. Yeah. But we were connecting to each other. We were exercising. We were giving back. And it looked like the seniors were really having a good time, because instead of kind of like being, not talking to each other and slumped, I mean, an administrator came out scowling and with a mask on, and then afterwards she took it off and was smiling and was chatting with some of her staff. So I don't know. I mean, would you say that would be an example of taking stock, seeing what we've lost, grieving, responding naturally, and saying, hey, the only way I can heal myself is by giving back?
Totally.
Like, what would you say we're doing as a group?
So I would say that I want to come back and do the science of happiness for you, because you just hit a whole bunch of the markers. There are more, of course, but what the research shows in a very compelling way is that people who recognize that social support, line dancing together definitely falls under that category, and doing for others are two of the biggest and longest lasting resilience skills, so to speak. And those who look for what's right instead of looking what's wrong all the time, because of course plenty was wrong, but that way lies despair if that's all you think about. So people who did what you did, staying together, meeting periodically, doing for others, a lot of churches and other organizations really revved up their, like here in Lakewood where I live, a couple religious organizations of all stripes, which is also very thrilling to see people have different ideas of how to serve, all coming up with service that mattered. And they were putting up, trees with mittens and gloves on, like 25 of them in one yard. And a bunch of them built little pantries so that people who couldn't get immediately to the food pantry, the big ones, could get intermediate meals. And then a whole bunch of, I was emailing and texting and putting on Facebook, if you want to be supportive during the pandemic, help fill this pantry that's right on the street, you can go whenever you want. Those kinds of things are just essential. And of course, when we knew our neighbors and when we lived closer to our relatives, all those things happened just naturally because people were around the corner or down the street. And now we have to make it happen, and you did. So A+, kudos to you. And I'm an extrovert, so I think doing those kinds of things is what kept me from losing my mind during the past year. So, well, let's keep going if we may, because I want to make sure I get in this model for grief that I think you'll all find helpful. I can send this to you as a handout, or you can sketch it on a napkin. That's part of the beauty of it. So back to my friend who said, people are losing their houses and losing their possessions. What can we do for them? Well, we get to give 6-hour workshop on resilience skills. I'm going to run through a few. But I think having words and images for what you're feeling is the first and biggest liberation. And so this was sketched by, well, I'll run through it with you. It's called the ball in the box model. And what I love about it is you can draw it on a napkin for somebody and send them home, or send them home with on a, just a piece of scrap paper. And so here's what it looks like. Let me go through it with you. So Lauren Herschel, bless her heart, went to the doctor and she was caring for an elder and grieving. And she felt like garbage. Big surprise. Some people don't realize that physically grief takes a lot out of you too. But she was smart enough to go and consult her physician. When the physician heard that she was both a caregiver and a griever, the physician sketched this on a piece of scrap paper in the office and explained to her that in the beginning, when you suffer a loss or when you have what's called anticipatory loss as a caregiver, in other words, taking care of somebody, but you know they're not going to live to be 100. So you're already anticipating that they will eventually be gone. And that's normal. Or if you care for somebody with dementia, that doesn't make you a monster. That makes you normal. If you care for somebody with dementia, my mom had dementia, and she just slipped away over a period of 10 years. That was 10 years of anticipatory grief, watching her lose inch by inch, you know. So in the beginning, the ball is huge. You can't move the box without the ball hitting the pain button, which is the little red button. The grief rattles around on its own in there and hits the button over and over. You can't control it. It just keeps hurting, and sometimes it seems unrelenting. We know from research on stress that the most stressful condition for primates, which includes us, is helplessness. So one of the reasons grief is so devastating is because not only are you feeling the lack of things, but you feel helpless in the face of the lack of those things. It's a double whammy to begin with, without a pandemic sitting on your shoulder. Over time, the ball gets smaller. It hits the button less and less, but when it does, it hurts just as much. Okay, that's important. Some people call that a grief tsunami or a grief meltdown or whatever. That's what my interviewee was describing when she was reaching for the roast in the grocery store. She was already partway into her grieving experience. She was starting to feel better sometimes, or at least feel a little bit like herself again sometimes. And then she reaches for her roast and the ball hits the pain button and she loses it all over again. That's normal. She wasn't sure that was normal. So we had a wonderful conversation about that. It's better because you can function day to day more easily, but the downside is that the ball randomly hits that button when you least expect it. So I think this could happen in regard to giving up possessions as well, or say somebody's moving and they were used to feeding the birds and now they can't feed the birds. One morning they'll get up and they'll be looking for their bird seed. Then they remember, oh yeah, I can't feed the birds here in this new living situation. That's an example of the ball hitting the pain button. For most people, the ball never really goes away. That's so important. That's what we learned from all the research, like the tasks of mourning. The ball never really goes away for most people. It might hit less and less, and you have more time to recover between hits, unlike when the ball was still giant. And then Lauren Hirschfield tweeted that she thought this was the best description of grief she'd heard in a long time. And clearly she had her finger on the pulse of the community, and so did that physician, because this went viral and started showing up everywhere on social media. Why? Because it resonates with people. All right. So if you haven't seen this model, this is a beautiful addition to or alternative to the stages mentality. You can see how it's much more tasks of mourning focused than it is stages focused, and it really helps people. Okay, let me pause there for a minute just to say that this is one way to talk about grief brain. And then I encourage all you helping professionals to use the words grief brain, because part of what I've learned from teaching on this topic is that just knowing that grief brain is a thing, like chemo brain or after baby brain. If any of you have children, you know how you're kind of in a fog those first weeks and months. Helps people because they're being plagued by it, but they think there's something wrong with them. So would anybody like to question or comment or disagree respectfully, of course, here? I'm always open to yeah, buts. Yeah, but what about this or that? Sometimes that's where the good energy is, especially when you're grieving. Anybody, anything in the chat box you want to tell me about?
It looks like I'll just read one of the comments, and then maybe I want to call on Mary Naras Pack, who has a question for you
Please.
as well, if Mary's on the
Yes.
call. But our city seems to be transitioning from closing to reopening as we welcome the draft. Some of the bars are launching their own home brews or different kinds of drafts for the NFL draft. And it looks like people want to be outside, assuming it ever stops raining, to celebrate. Hey, you know, we lived, we survived, and
Yes,
let's try to reconnect with each other.
yes, thank you.
Any comments on how we're operating as a city versus as individuals?
I would say that the extroverts are very eager to get back out there. The Atlantic just wrote a funny article, but also instructive, called The Oncoming War Between Introverts and Extroverts. And the topic of the article was that extroverts can't wait to get back out there. And I'm one of them. So when I got my second shot, I felt like I'd won the lottery, you know. But introverts have been kind of waiting for this all their lives. And they're a little bit concerned because they liked being home. They get their energy from being quiet and being home. Extroverts get their energy from being out and being with people. So one of my hopes as we reopen everything up again is that people will become more knowledgeable and respectful about what makes each other tick. So my husband and I are both teachers. Both of our kids, we're both extroverts, duh. Both of our kids are introverts, and we're very close family. We've actually adopted the language of, is this an introvert thing, or are you guys starting to get hungry? Because we are, and maybe in a half an hour we should go eat, because introverts want a little more time to process things, whereas extroverts don't know what they think until they hear themselves say it out loud. And so this is a really big difference in people that has not always been acknowledged and or respected. So as you are eager to get back out, please respect your introvert friends who are saying, I'm just not ready to do that yet, or I could do it in a month, but I can't do it now. Otherwise, they'll have to lie to you, make things up for why they're not ready to re-enter at the same pace.
Kim, do you think part of the grief brain is fear too for people?
Oh, yes.
You know, okay,
Remember
now
what I
I have
said
my
about
second,
helplessness, that
right.
grief brain makes people feel helpless, and feeling helpless makes you afraid, and then that triggers a whole bunch of physical and mental reactions with, you know, stress hormones pouring into your bloodstream, and your brain starts going whoop whoop whoop, DEFCON 5.
Because
You know,
even with the,
even though it's something that you used to do all the time, like eat outside with a group of people,
right,
you know,
and they're still
that's
afraid
normal.
even with the second shot, like, oh,
Right.
I'm not sure it's okay yet. And I think that's part of, you went through the grief, now
Yeah.
you're not sure you're ready
Right.
to
Well,
move
when
forward.
death is the stakes, I mean, yes, we've been getting a little used to this because we lived through it for a year, but the stakes are high. You know, I mean, it was a mess, right? I mean, is that all? Do we need to say any more? It was a mess, and
Mhm.
it still is. And the vulnerable are still vulnerable, more than we might like. And the research is still ongoing. So, yeah, there's plenty of fear. Of course, there is. I mean, we have to work with it so that we don't all become, you know, agoraphobics, but it's there. All right, let's
Do you
keep going. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
do you feel like we're all going to have some kind of grief or be fearful for many years to come in
I
dealing with the pandemic?
I do think that people who lived through the pandemic are going to have trauma similar to people who lived through the Great Depression or the World Wars, or you know, the Warsaw Ghetto, or other terrible experiences that were very life and death, either for you yourself or your loved ones. Now, here's the good news. This is why I want to talk about resilience, or maybe even come back and talk to you about that. Resilience is, we are more resilient than we realize. This is part of the way we see resilience is cultural. So we have this kind of toxic, like everything's going to be okay, just think positive, blah, 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 which eventually can get okay. But there's truth in that too, which is that people are more resilient than they think. So I'm trying to think of the name of the researcher. It'll come to me. People who've done research with groups that have been highly traumatized, like survivors of the Hiroshima bombing or the Dresden bombing, or survivors after the tsunami that happened in January, you know, some years back, have found that people are more resilient than you think. So a smaller percentage than you might anticipate actually emerge from those traumas with like serious ongoing mental illnesses. So that's the good news. Okay. The not as good news is that part of what helps people be resilient in the face of trauma is social support, the ability to find words for what they're experiencing, the ability to talk it out, and a strong social kind of net so that they don't have to worry about loss at the same time they're worrying about health care and losing their home and some of you won't want to hear this, but forgive me, the research is there and I don't apologize for it. America does not have a strong social net. We don't have a guaranteed, kind of minimum income. We don't have strong supports in place for our elderly. People who have money get top care for their elderly. Others have to figure out what they're going to do. The American plan for taking care of an elder, one person said this, and I say it with my tongue in cheek, not to offend anybody, but thought it was an interest. She was in the healthcare field for her whole career. She said, here's the American healthcare plan. Some woman quits her job and takes care of the elder. We don't have a strong network for that. So given all that, some of the trauma will be ongoing because we might not have the help we need to unburden ourselves now that the crisis is starting to ramp down. And
Kim, don't you think that that's also the reason for increased suicide rate?
I
You
do.
don't have that support network that you talk to, and young people who didn't have the same support network that maybe you or I had growing up
Yes,
are really vulnerable to this.
they are. My heart goes out to millennials and Gen Zs and the teenagers who went through the pandemic because they were already experiencing a lot of loneliness. We all know, I think, in this field that elders are in a crisis of loneliness, but what's less recognized sometimes is that younger people also are. So baby boomers, which I am one, tend to have strong social networks, and Gen Xers have reasonable social networks. But millennials and Zs and teens and the elderly are really struggling from these rapid social changes coupled with not strong social networks or safety networks provided by the government, for example. So when you look at the world happiness results, which are released every year, there's a whole bunch of Scandinavian countries that have like good elder care. They have high taxes, yeah, but they also have strong government support programs for children and elders and so on. And they just keep trading places in the top 10 world happiness scores. And at the beginning of the world happiness scores, the United States didn't even make it into the top 20 for years and years. And now we finally made it into the top 20. But I mean, I love this country, don't get me wrong. And I think there's a lot that's right. And I'm grateful. And it's not easy. And I think we saw that. I think we saw that we need to strengthen our mental health program. I think we saw that we need to make our healthcare program more equitable because we all suffer. I mean, nothing like herd immunity and the lack thereof to show us, one more thing to grieve about and one more thing that probably needs to be addressed and maybe fixed. All right, I'm going to move on. A lot of times I say a little bit here, but if you're interested in the book, you'll find it. So grievers need robust resilience skills, not only for the anticipatory grief that comes with caregiving, but also for disenfranchised grief and complicated grief and ambiguous loss. So in response to the question, what can we do to help these elders as they're experiencing all these losses? My primary answer is tutor them, coach them, get them into workshops that help them prepare and find wisdom in the pain that they are experiencing. So when I teach people about disenfranchised grief, for example, or when I give them words like ambiguous loss, right off the bat, they're empowered because now they know what to try to learn more about. So let me go through some of these quickly. Some of you know all this, so forgive me. Others, this will be the beginning of of wonderful learning for you, I hope. So what's disenfranchised grief? Well, the go-to guy for disenfranchised grief is Ken Doka. So jot his name down. His writings are good, but just Googling disenfranchised grief will bring up all kinds of good articles for the regular person. Not, you don't have to read the research. You can read regular blog posts about it from grief education resources. And it's defined as grief that persons experience when they occur a loss that is not or cannot be openly acknowledged, socially sanctioned, or publicly mourned. So it has these characteristics. You incur a loss that cannot or is not openly acknowledged, socially sanctioned, or publicly mourned. If you can think of some examples, throw them in the chat box. I'm going to give you a few. The loss of a pet is a perfect example of disenfranchised grief. The research shows that for some people, the loss of a cherished pet is as big a loss as the loss of a friend. All right. And yet in our culture, there are a huge number of people who would say it's just a dog, get over it, adding insult to injury. Now, on a positive note, I do think this is changing. I'm starting to see greeting cards that can be purchased and mailed to somebody who's lost a pet. And I see a lot of sympathy on Facebook and other social media sites for people who post about the loss of a pet. And that's a great movement, because when I was young, there wasn't a lot of that to go around. But we're not so awakened yet about other kinds of loss. So for example, say I am in my second marriage and I learn that my first husband has died and I feel sad. And then I think, why should I feel sad? I divorced him. That's over. I haven't talked to him in 15 years. But it is normal. That's a disenfranchised grief, because when you married, you were full of hope and love, and you had some good years probably. And you are grieving those, and you are re-grieving what you felt at the divorce. And yet there aren't that many people you can tell that to who are going to understand it. They're going to try and talk you out of those feelings or comfort you out of those feelings. Other examples of disenfranchised grief are people who are in a gay relationship, perhaps, that hasn't been acknowledged. So they're losing a beloved and cherished partner of many years. But if they chose for some reason never to marry, they don't have legal rights, and they can't openly acknowledge perhaps how they feel. And we could go on and on. So I encourage you, especially if you're in a helping profession, to just look at a list of disenfranchised griefs. Just Google that, and it will really be helpful, I think. And then there's complicated grief. That's a phrase given to a longer path and more need for professional help. So some of you may want to address this and maybe more knowledgeable than I am about it. But what I'm hearing and reading is that 2 years is an average. Okay, not, oh no, 2 years, I'm not done yet. But an average amount of time for people to start to be able to resume a reasonable, normal life, to have moved into their new normal. Now, remember, that doesn't mean you're through the grief or over the grief or you never think about the person anymore. One of my favorite quotes in my book is from Anne Lamott, and Anne Lamott said that when you lose somebody, you can learn to dance again, but you always will dance with a limp. And I thought that was a great image of how you learn to carry the grief. That's my preferred phrase for it. I'm learning to carry the grief, or I have learned to carry the grief. I still think about them. Of course I do. You lose a child 25 years ago, or you have a miscarriage. You still think about that child sometimes on the day you had that miscarriage. I do. And wonder what that child would have been like. And if you believe in an afterlife, hope to see them again, And that doesn't mean that I haven't grieved it. It just means I'm a human being and I still have continuing bonds with that miscarried child, or, that child that died at any age. For some people, feelings of loss are debilitating and they don't improve even after time passes. So in complicated grief, painful emotions are so long lasting and so severe that the griever has trouble recovering from the loss and resuming their own life. So I give you this as a definition so that we don't make grief into a mental illness. It's a normal process, and we have to realize when grief has become so debilitating that additional help is needed and it's time to make a referral. All right, what are some practical strategies? Well, there are some sources of support that work for introverts and some that work for extroverts. So I always personally encourage participation in programs that address caregiving, support, or loss and griefs of all kinds. And there are books, as Melinda pointed out, that will talk about grief in general. So not just the grief from a death, but grief from other kinds of losses too, like divorce and moving and the end of a friendship and so on. And if you just use your Google powers, you can find them. So I recommend those. But not everybody makes it in a grief group. We know from the research that a lot of people go to 1 or 2 sessions and then they drop out. Some of those people are introverts and they have to find other ways to learn about resilience and support. Sometimes counseling helps those folks, even if they don't have complicated grief. And sometimes it's because the support group isn't very good. I heard some really unfortunate stories about support groups while I was interviewing people, support groups that were too big, 16, 20 people. The average ideal size for a support group is 8 to 10 max, according to the research. Sometimes the facilitator isn't very knowledgeable about grief. They're just the newest hire, and so they get asked to do it. One person told me that she was really eager to go to the support group, and then she got to one. This was one associated with a hospital, and there were 16 people there. And the first night, the facilitator had all 16 people tell the story of their loss. So everyone was crying and like traumatized, not only by their own grief, but by the grief of 15 other people. She said, I never went back. I said, yeah, I can understand that. So that's a thing, like don't judge people if they don't want to go to a grief group. They might be too introverted for that, or they may have had a negative experience. But there are some websites and online communities that, if you can access them, really have skillful people in them where you can get excellent advice and good referrals. And 2 books that I want to suggest if you want grief support, but you're not a group person, is this one that I'm holding up called Healing After Loss by Martha W. Hickman. And she's gone. Her husband is gone. I tried to write to her to say how much this book helped me. And then I found out that she and her husband both died. But it's been a continuous print, and it has 5 stars on Amazon from hundreds, if not thousands, of reviewers. So don't take my word for it. It's very slim and readable. It's a small book, and it's a daily thing. And this woman really gets grief. And then another one, I would say hers is spiritual, but not religious. So she may refer to an afterlife, or she may use the word God, but she's not trying to convert you to any one position. And this one is even more neutral in terms of like God talk, but I would consider it very spiritual. And this is written by a woman who is a grief counselor and has run groups for years and years. And she's a Zen chaplain who volunteers in hospices. And, I read this book after I wrote my own book, and I love it. It's called Opening to Grief, Finding Your Way from Loss to Peace. It's by Claire B, as in boy, Willis, Willis. And it's practical, it's wise. Claire Willis really has the right stuff. So I would suggest both of those. And if others have suggestions, because we're running out of time, please put them into the chat box. So knowledge is power. Help grievers know what to expect, which has been part of my message today. Be sure to make it part of your all of your work or conversations that people are more resilient than they think. And then direct people to very non-threatening, extremely helpful social media resources. And I followed these for years before I started to recommend them, because I don't want to send anybody to anything that isn't good. And the ones that I recommend the most are Option B, based on, it came out of the book Option B. What's Your Grief, which I love, and which you can have email. So even if your client isn't a social media person, you can help them sign up for emails, and then they get What's Your Grief through email. And those blogs are terrific. Some of the articles that I'm going to send you come from there, so you can judge for yourself. And then there's a group called Grief Anonymous that gets how different griefs are different. This is a social media platform, but they do have a website. And Grief Anonymous has subgroups. So if you've lost a husband or a wife, you can join those subgroups. If you've been through a divorce, you can join that subgroup. If you lost a pet, you can join that subgroup. So you can be in the overarching Grief Anonymous group and subgroups that fit the losses that you've experienced. So I'm going to take some questions again, and I can stay a few extra minutes if you like, but I want to end with this quote, which I think is a great balance to our culture of cluelessness sometimes, or not always getting it. So Laurie Duchenne says, it's oversimplified to say happiness is a choice. It's more accurate to say happiness takes lots of choices that are sometimes hard to make, like the choice to accept ourselves and our struggles, the choice to take responsibility for getting help, and the choice to do the things that are good for us, even when, especially when, we feel like giving up. And this is a quote that I've actually printed and I hand it out to people at workshops. I hand it out to people that I coach who have grief, because I think this embodies the road to learning how to dance even again, learning how to sing again, even when we've learned how to carry something that's very heavy. All right. So I didn't talk about ambiguous loss yet. I'm happy to take questions on that if that's a new term to you.
Are there folks who would like to ask questions of Kim? I know we're coming up on 12:30, but here's an opportunity to jump in.
If you need to go. And if you need, I can stay 5 minutes or so and talk fast, as you know.
Overall, you had mentioned that, you know, grief can go on for 2 years, or finally somebody gets, you know, maybe to feel comfortable at that point. Does anybody ever really stop grieving?
Yes, there are.
When they
The
reach-
research shows that there are some people who really and truly identify with the phrase, you know, I'm over it. They are philosophical types who were well aware before they suffered the loss that nothing lasts forever, and they are living pretty content lives and so on. But the majority of people, and remember I said 2 years is an average, the majority of
Right.
people learn how to carry the grief. So they will still cry once in a while. They will still have moments when they really miss the person. And that's why tasks of grief is so useful and insight for them, because they learn how to maybe talk to the dead person. Or I have one friend who visits the favorite site of her daughter who died young. They go there every year in camp. That's part of her grieving process. She doesn't feel like she's stuck in her grief. She just wants to go to that place because it reminds her of this beloved daughter. Is that helpful? Now, what I
So-
don't recommend is people who say, I'll never get over it. There's this whole strand of our culture that thinks it's not okay to laugh while you're grieving, that if you laugh, you're somehow disloyal to the departed loved one, that it's like a kind of heroism to say, I never got over it. And I give that the buzzer, because for one thing, the loved one would never, if they loved you, want you to, quotes, never get over it. They would want you to learn to carry it if they loved you. And it's no badge of courage to stay miserable or even more unhappy than happy, because you're still alive. And so all we can do is keep swimming. All we can do is keep singing. It's okay to learn how to sing again.
I think that goes back to it's a choice. I mean, it's a series of choices. It's not just one
series.
choice to be happy and move on. It's a series of choices. Each time something happens, going camping is a choice to remember the daughter, but then moves on with the day, right? So I think it's
Exactly.
a series of choices.
You don't stay stuck. And that's why some people use the terms move on, because what they mean is don't stay stuck. But some people object to the language move on because it makes it sound like you just forget about that
Like you
person.
don't care anymore.
Exactly. So I'm trying to help people find language that fits them.
I think before, I know we only have a couple minutes, but I will tell you what I find, like with my mother and carrying that burden, is she used to carry it well, but the older she's gotten, she cries over it more frequently. Simple things like the loss of a pet,
Yes.
which is I don't know what has changed for her, but maybe it's coming to grips with her own
Mortality.
mortality. Yeah.
That would have to be part of it. But I can also offer that the research shows that every loss awakens every other loss. That's so important. I'm going to say it again. Every loss awakens every other loss. So say you really had to be brave, or you were still raising kids when your spouse died. Okay. Then 15 years later, the kids are raised, you've done a lot of grief work, and your beloved cat dies, and you go to pieces for a week. That's because the loss of the cat is inviting you to do some of the grief work that you literally didn't have time to do when you were busy picking up the pieces and raising kids. And
That makes
that's
so much sense.
normal.
Makes so
Also,
much.
as people age, they sometimes get a kind of beautiful vulnerability, a kind of luminous old age where their hearts are very soft. I've seen this happen with my own elders. And one of my elder friends says, I don't know what's going on with me, but I cry when we sing at church. She said, my heart is so soft now. She's 85.
Mhm.
Might be partly that too.
That's
you
really
know, really,
valuable.
it
those
is,
of us-
right? We need more
Mhm.
soft people with soft hearts in culture. You know, as long as they're not miserable all the time, if it's truly soft heartedness, that's a wisdom.
Right. Well, we are at 12:30. Are there any last questions? Anybody? There were a lot of very positive comments to you in the chat.
Oh,
that you said
good.
you
So
can't
maybe somebody
see.
can send them to me. That always
Yeah.
helps me get better. And it makes me feel like I'm not wasting my life. So thank you for that.
Well, and this is recorded, so you can always go and see it as well. So,
Oh, thank you. And also, if you don't know what ambiguous loss is, I didn't have time to talk about it. Please look it up, because knowing what ambiguous loss is a great strength. It'll help you and it'll help other people.
I think we may
There was
need
a
to
lot
have
of it
you
in the
back.
pandemic. I'm sorry, Melinda.
I think we may need to have you back to talk about
Oh,
that type
well,
of.
bless you. I would love to come back. I mean, we could do something informal where I just talk to you about ambiguous loss and then we process it together. That would be
Absolutely.
awesome. So thank you for coming, everybody. I always feel so trusted when people show up at a workshop and you don't know me from Adam. And thank you, Shalom, for your organization sponsoring this. And Melinda, you've been a joy to work with.
Oh, thank you. You as well. We appreciate you.
Well, we're all out there doing our best, right? That's
There-
one of the slogans that came out of the pandemic. Everybody needs to just do their best.
Well, for those of you who are on the call or still on the call, if you Google her, you will find other things and be able to listen to her in other platforms that she's been on.
Oh,
So,
thanks. And you can email me too. I can throw
Right.
you onto my email list if you want.
okay.
Well, good day, everybody. Good life, everybody, and keep on trucking. We're not through this thing yet, but I really think one of the few good things that's going to come out of the pandemic is that everybody got a chance to grow. Not everybody took that chance, but a lot did.
Mhm.
So let's hope that in addition to trauma, we emerge with wisdom.
Great ending.
Thank
for
you.
that. Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
You so
Thanks, everybody.
Very
Thank you,
so
Kim.
much.
Thank you.
Great
It's my
information,
pleasure.
excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Very much appreciate your what you've brought to us, helping us to look inward so that we can look outward in a healing way for ourselves
Yes.
and for others. God bless.
Absolutely. Bless you too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.